Hello everyone, welcome in. This is section 3, produce a design that matches the tone of a character, and this section is titled Additional Practice Applying Theory, in Chyan's Coloso class, drawing and coloring anime style characters. So welcome in guys, it's been a little bit. I've been dealing with finishing up my second job, which I'm officially done with, and apologies in advance if you hear a dog barking. I have a neighbor that's moved in upstairs and they have like super obnoxious dogs, but hopefully I'm going to be moving out to a new place with some more roommates, friends of mine, come the end of this month. So super exciting stuff. I'll be able to move into a bigger location for cheaper, have more square footage, and a lot more of a secluded space to be able to work on my content. So really exciting stuff. As well as I see that we're actually super close to 100 subscribers, which is super exciting for me. It shows that there's a lot of people that are really interested in my content, which is not only extremely flattering, and I appreciate the support that you guys show on these videos and my content, but it also really inspires me to try and produce more content and work even harder to show you guys what I'm really interested in and the things that I want to develop for this channel. I do have some things planned for 100 subscribers, so look forward to seeing that once we hit the milestone. We're super close, so I'm sure it's not going to take any time at all. Nonetheless, really exciting stuff, and thank you all so much again, as always. And remember, you can always help to further the milestone if you have not done so already by subscribing to the channel and keeping on top of other content released by it. In any case, getting right into today's lecture, it was honestly all about composition and applying everything that we've learned so far in terms of characters and theory into compositional practices, so we know really how to design our characters and approach them from the compositional standpoint. So getting started, for considering gaze, eyes tend to read from left to right, top to bottom, which is also known as the Z form or line. So if you've taken an art appreciation course or you know about the concept of how we view things, this idea of the Z form / line is actually subjective depending on the cultural aspects of reading. So it's said to actually be reversed in Japan because they read from right to left. So keep in mind a lot of things can really vary on this idea, but it still illustrates the importance of setting a solid composition and one that flows from the opposing corners of the canvas as well as the center of it. So the more that this Z form line is adhered to, the calmer the feeling of the composition, because it's much easier for the viewer's eyes to track and follow all of the compositional elements that are within the canvas. Generally though, you want to avoid the bottom left corner for important compositional elements, and you want to center the elements as much as possible. This is more of a stereotype, and Chyan kind of mentions this in the lecture, but the bottom left corner generally isn't a very appealing place when you're trying to convey important information regarding the visual piece that you're trying to show. So in general, it's just better to avoid it, and then center everything, like said, to that Z line as much as possible, or just try to bring in the elements closer to the center of the canvas. Now, in terms of illustration, adding the fundamental compositional aspects along the general direction will create an experience within the illustration, or really creating a cohesion of the viewing points within the composition using the Z line. Usually in an illustration featuring only a character, the gaze will move from face downwards unless there are more prominent elements. So keep in mind normally, and this is just from a human standpoint, when we view a human character, the first thing we're going to try to identify is its face, and then everything around the face, normally from the body down. So that's where that point comes from. With gaze, we actually have two types, the main one being what focuses on the character, and the subgaze, which is the feeling that the gaze creates from the illustration. The best way to kind of define it is like the atmosphere of the illustration. So character illustrations that revert the natural movement of the gaze or have dynamic elements that disrupt it will actually make a stronger impression. Chyan kind of shows this by showing one of his example illustrations in which he designed a character that has sort of elements around their silhouette that actually intersect the Z line and go perpendicular to the character within the composition. So it creates a disruptive flow for the person viewing it, and it creates this sort of cycle of repeating between the character, moving down the character, seeing this perpendicular compositional element disrupt the canvas, and then viewing along it all the way back up to the top, and then rinsing and repeating the viewing experience. So because of that, when you're designing simpler characters with less compositional elements to work with, perspective and dynamic posing between the upper and lower body can create more detail if you're trying to create more of this strong impression for the viewer. For illustrations, you generally want to try to keep the canvas full. There is uses of blank space, but that might stress more of the background illustration, in which we're more so focusing on character illustration for this course and for this purpose. Keep in mind that no matter if you want a calm composition or you want a composition that's dynamic in the viewing experience, you want to position and plan your compositional elements to create a repeating flow of gaze. So Chyan shows this in another one of his example illustrations in which he has a calm composition with a character that's just standing, but he uses background elements to try and tie in and surround the character, so that way they act as compositional elements and naturally bring the viewer's eye back to the character in the center, which creates this repeating flow of gaze. And this kind of comes in with that point, but placing character and elements of composition next to each other creates a stronger impression because the viewing experience is much more dense. In contrast, a larger size of the gaze will create more breathing room for the composition and a calmer effect. So now that we've talked about the idea behind designing our compositions, we can talk more about the practicality of this in play. So the first thing you're going to want to do is start composing some thumbnails, which you want to jot and plan the points of emphasis of your composition. So that might include where your character is going to be, how they're going to be sort of portrayed, and ways that you might need for your compositional effect, whether, like I said, you want that calm or more dynamic, as well as background elements in regards to that character. The top points of practice within illustration are characters, materials, and compositions, including multiple characters. These are all frequent cases that you're going to be designing illustrations. And the reason we're going over this is because these are actually the top 3 ways that you're normally going to be designing your composition and consideration around. And we'll go a little bit more about that through here. For cute characters, elements of composition to both the main and sub gaze should complement each other on the overall atmosphere or the situation of the illustration. That is to say that for designing illustrations around cute characters, what's normally cuter about them is sort of the situation that they're drawn within rather than the character himself, even though the character itself can be cute too. So a way to show this is that the character might have a cute item or be doing a cute pose or whatever that helps complement the effect of the character. And if you're designing a situation like that in context to your illustration, obviously you're going to have to consider what compositional elements and how you're going to have to design them to create that effect for the character. In contrast, for pretty or calm characters, the elements of the composition should aim back towards the character, which is going to be the subject of illustrations. Because of this, they're going to be mainly the focus, so it helps to have the compositional elements to act more like a circulatory aid for your center of view, which is going to be your character. Now for compositions with 2 or more characters, a main element and sub-elements need to be decided between the 2 characters, or if evaluated equally between both characters, they need to share a lot of compositional information for the gaze of each of them to meet. This happens because in the prior 2 examples where we have a character with different materials or props or in a different situation, or a character that's alone and maybe has background elements, the character is still the focus of the illustration. But with illustrations with 2 or more characters, now we don't really know which one to prioritize, and that's where these 2 points really need to be stressed. Either you need to decide a character that is going to be the main point, and that's going to be the center of focus in the illustration, or at least have more dominance as the center of focus in the illustration. Or if the characters are going to share focus within the composition, they need to have parts of them that overlap, so it makes it less noisy of a viewing experience for those who are looking at your illustration. Chyan really showed this in like a boxing standoff sort of scene. If you were to frame this as an illustration, it's super noisy because you don't really know which characters to sort of focus on, and there's not a lot of cohesion between viewing each character back and forth. Versus if you square them off and you put them closer together so that there's different elements of each character that are almost touching in compositional elements, it'll make it easier to sort of view between one character and then transition between the other one near the point of their contact, and then view the other side of the canvas without too much distraction. If there's going to be a natural flow between these characters, it's generally better to choose a main element between the characters. So if there's a general underlying theme between them that they share, it's normally going to be easier to choose a main element between the characters that can make them easy. This might be characters that are in conflict, the 2 of them meeting fists, so that way when viewing the illustration, you can bounce between one character and then use the arm and the fist of them meeting to transition to viewing the other character, and so on and so forth. As for characters that aren't clashing in nature and theme, it helps for them to overlap versus characters that are in conflict, which will meet each other in gaze. The best way to think about this is that even though you can design characters that are in love or maybe not conflicting in nature between the contextual atmosphere that you draw within the illustration for them, by having the gaze of each character overlap. So for this kind of composition where the characters are in conflict, it's going to be easier to draw a gaze where the lines of their gaze are going to meet. So like I said, that's going to be that example of them connecting fists in a fight. Maybe they're squaring off against each other chest to chest, versus this where the characters are more intertwined with each other. You can literally show that in a compositional element by having characters cuddle into each other. The gaze of either of them will meet into each other where you can see both of them. So like I said, cuddling would be a good example where like you might start viewing the character from their limbs and their legs that are closer to the foreground of the illustration, but then draw in together to them cuddling in the middle ground. That's just an example, but keep in mind that you can develop underlying compositional themes using the idea of designing how your viewers are going to gaze upon your illustration. So it was a little bit difficult to try and put into words, but I hope that helps in summarizing the way that Chyan sort of builds upon trying to design and plan compositional elements that best support your underlying illustrational theme. So quick summary to everything here: understand main and sub-gaze and appropriate use cases for each. Like said, main gaze is going to be mainly upon the character, and sub-gaze is going to be the compositional elements you design around the character or the main gaze in order to help supplement the underlying feeling that you want to build upon your illustration. You want to frame your character and compositional elements in a way that complements the intention of the atmosphere of the illustration, or really have a underlying cohesion with everything that you design for the composition and how you intend for the illustration to come off and the underlying themes that it has. And then know and practice the most common case examples of character illustration, which, like said, that's going to be your character studies, your materials or props that they use, and then compositions including multiple characters as your most frequent cases for illustrations. And then the self-assigned homework that I thought was relevant that Chyan actually pretty much mentions to do in your free time is to create a dynamic thumbnail of each kind of common case illustration. So that's going to be your single character, your materials and props, or your multiple characters case, using simple characters, like said, nothing that's too complicated. So that way you can focus more on the compositional elements and how you're framing the illustration rather than using the complexity of the character as a crutch for detail and intention for your illustration. And then for an extra, you can draw a calm thumbnail of each kind as well. This is going to be less impactful, but it's still going to help get across the underlying intention of this lecture. So that was section 3.1. I hope that helps. Really exciting stuff as we move into the more practical aspects of seeing how Chyan sets up an illustration of his. So really exciting stuff to look forward to. And keep in mind, you can always keep on top of the upload schedule, as well as any subsequent uploads or any other content of mine on my socials, which you can check out around here. Like said, I really hope this helped for those that were interested in the compositional elements of Chyan's planning for his illustrations. And as always, thank you so much for joining me in this lecture review, and I hope to see you in the next one. And as always, I hope you have a good day. Bye-bye now.